Nobody survives being called cute by a Veari warrior. That's not an exaggeration. That's just biology. The Veari are 8 feet of layered muscle, serrated bone ridges, and evolutionary history written entirely in the language of violence. Their growl alone, the deep, chest-rattling sound they use when they want to remind the universe who's in charge, has been known to make grown soldiers wet themselves. It has caused stampedes. It has stopped wars. And Daniel Reeves, a 31-year-old mechanical engineer from the colony of Redstone Reach, heard that growl for the very first time and said, without thinking, barely above a whisper, "Oh, that's kind of cute." The silence that followed was the loudest thing he had ever experienced. Daniel Reeves had never wanted to be a hero. He had never even particularly wanted to be interesting. What he wanted, what he had always wanted, was a decent cup of coffee, a machine that ran the way it was supposed to, and enough quiet at the end of the day to hear himself think. The frontier colony of Redstone Reach gave him all three, most of the time, and he considered that more than enough. Redstone Reach sat on the outer edge of the Valeric cluster, a collection of terraformed worlds that humanity had been slowly stitching together over the past 2 centuries. It wasn't glamorous. The soil was rust-colored and stubborn. The winds came in hard from the eastern ridgeline every evening, and the nearest city with a real hospital was 3 days away by transport ship. What the colony had was a working water reclamation system, a magnetic or processor, and a population of about 4,000 people who had chosen the hard life on purpose because the alternative was a crowded inner-world apartment with no sky. Daniel had been there for 6 years. He kept the machines running. He knew every pipe, every coupling, every pressure valve on the settlement's mechanical grid. He was good at it, in a way that very few people are good at anything, not with flash or pride, but with a quiet, total competence that meant things just worked when he touched them. He was also, by most accounts, deeply ordinary. He was medium height, medium build, with the kind of face you'd trust immediately but struggle to describe an hour later. He had brown hair that he cut himself and brown eyes that people called warm when they were being kind and unremarkable when they weren't. He owned 7 identical gray work shirts. His social life consisted primarily of weekly dinners with his colleague Mara and occasional card games with the overnight maintenance crew. He had not been in a romantic relationship in 4 years and had mostly stopped thinking about it. He did not carry a weapon. He did not train in combat. He did not particularly worry about the threats that lurked beyond the colony's perimeter, because the colony had soldiers for that, and Daniel was not a soldier. All of this is important context for understanding what happened on the morning of the 14th of March, in the shadow of the colony's eastern or processor, when Daniel Reeves came face to face with Kara the Veari, and said the word that would eventually change the shape of the known galaxy. He had been out there since dawn, tracing a pressure fault in the processor's secondary coolant line. The fault wasn't critical, not yet, but Daniel had learned long ago that the things that aren't critical have a way of becoming critical the moment you stop paying attention to them. So he had brought his tools and his diagnostic kit and a thermos of the bad coffee that the commissary made, and he had settled in for the kind of slow, methodical work that he found genuinely satisfying. He heard the Veari before he saw her. Not the growl, not yet, just footsteps, heavy ones, with a rhythm that was wrong for human feet. Too deliberate, too balanced. Each step placed with the precision of something that had never in its life needed to worry about making noise. Daniel looked up from his work. She was standing at the edge of the processor's shadow, watching him. Kara stood nearly 8.5 feet tall. She had the broad, layered physique of her kind, shoulders like siege equipment, arms roped with thick muscle that moved under silver-gray skin in a way that suggested the skeleton underneath was doing something more sophisticated than human bones ever managed. Her face was angular, with the prominent orbital ridges and flat, wide nose of the Veari, and her eyes were the deep amber gold that Daniel had only ever seen in photographs. She wore the partial armor of a warrior on patrol, chest plate bracers, a short blade at her hip, and she carried herself with the absolute, unself-conscious confidence of a creature that had never once in its life wondered if it was taking up too much space. She was also, without question, the most physically impressive living thing Daniel had ever seen. He looked at her. She looked at him. He was crouching next to a coolant pipe with a wrench in one hand and a thermos in the other, and he thought, somewhat distantly, well, this is a situation. The Veari and the humans of Redstone Reach had a fragile coexistence. The Veari hunting grounds overlapped with the colony's eastern expansion, and there had been an agreement, tense, bureaucratic, frequently violated on both sides, about territorial boundaries and mutual non-aggression. Veari warriors occasionally appeared on the colony's edges. Humans occasionally wandered too far into the hunting grounds. Nobody had died yet, but it was a kind of peace that felt like a hell breath. Daniel knew all of this. What he didn't know, what nobody had thought to tell him in the colony's official orientation materials, was what you were supposed to do when a Veari warrior appeared without warning while you were alone next to a piece of industrial equipment. He decided, after a moment, to do nothing dramatic. He nodded, politely. Caritha's eyes narrowed. Then she growled. It was not a small sound. It came from somewhere deep in her chest, resonating through her body and into the air with a physical pressure that Daniel felt in his back teeth and his sternum simultaneously. It rose in pitch and dropped again, a complex, layered vocalization that his nervous system interpreted with chemical certainty as danger, danger, danger. His hand tightened on the wrench. His heart rate spiked. His brain threw up every relevant piece of information it had. Fight, flight, freeze, the approximate distance to the colony gate, the fact that he had no weapon, the fact that this wouldn't matter anyway. And then, in the space between the second and third second of the growl, something strange happened. His brain caught up with his ears. The growl wasn't just loud. It was structured. There was a cadence to it, a kind of pattern that rose and fell with something almost like self-consciousness, like something performed. And combined with the way she was standing, not crouched, not advancing, weight evenly balanced, and the way her eyes were watching him with what he could only describe as attentiveness, she was waiting to see what he would do. She was testing him. And something about the gap between the terrifying sound and the very deliberate stillness of the creature making it struck Daniel Reeves as, against all reason, a little bit adorable. "Oh," he said softly, "that's kind of cute." The growl stopped. Kara stared at him. The silence stretched. A wind came in from the eastern ridge. Somewhere in the processor, a coolant pipe ticked. Daniel, becoming gradually aware of what he had just said, felt a very specific kind of calm settle over him. The calm of someone who has already done the thing that cannot be undone, and has therefore been freed from the anxiety of wondering whether they will do it. He looked back at her. Her mouth was slightly open. Her amber eyes were wide with something he didn't have a word for yet, but would later come to recognize as a Veari equivalent of complete and utter bewilderment. He picked up his thermos. He went back to the coolant pipe. Kara stood there for a long moment. Then she turned and walked back into the eastern wilderness without a sound. Daniel finished his repair. He drank his bad coffee. He went back to the colony. He thought about it the whole way home. The thing about earning a Veari warrior's attention is that you don't know you've done it until it's already too late. They don't send messages. They don't knock. They simply appear the way that apex predators appear, where they want to, when they want to, in a way that makes clear that the concept of permission was invented by creatures that needed it. And for 3 weeks after the morning by the processor, Kara appeared. Again and again and again. Daniel started keeping count. The second time was 4 days after first. Daniel was on the colony's western water tower, rerunning a calibration he'd done twice already, because the readings kept coming back slightly wrong, and slightly wrong had a way of becoming catastrophically wrong in water systems. He was 40 feet up, balanced on a maintenance platform the size of a dining room table, when he became aware of being watched. He looked down. Kareth was standing at the base of the tower. She had her arms crossed. She was looking up at him with an expression that suggested she found the situation both confusing and somewhat offensive. Daniel raised his wrench in a small greeting. She didn't move. He finished his calibration, climbed down, and landed on the ground about 10 feet from her. They stood there for a moment. She was close enough that he could see the detail of her armor, the precise geometry of her bone ridges, the way the amber in her eyes shifted in the morning light. She growled. This one was different. Shorter, sharper, a single percussive sound like a stone dropped into still water. Daniel considered it. Then he said, "Good morning to you two." Caritha's jaw moved, not speaking, just a slight movement of someone filing information away. She looked at him for another moment. then looked at the water tower, then back at him. "Calibrating the flow sensors," he said, for no particular reason other than that the silence felt like it wanted filling. The pressure readings were off by about 4%. Doesn't sound like much, but it's the kind of thing that cascades. He paused. "You probably don't care about that." She continued to look at him, her head tilted, just slightly, to the right, a small movement that Daniel would later learn was a Vaori gesture of focused attention. Then she turned and walked away again. Daniel watched her go. "See you around," he said, mostly to himself. He did. The third time was a week later, in the commissary at noon. Daniel was eating lunch, or attempting to. The commissary's protein substitute was going through one of its periodic phases of tasting like seasoned cardboard, when Mara, sitting across from him, went very still and stared at something behind his left shoulder. "Daniel," she said, in the voice of someone trying not to move their lips. There's a Vaori in the doorway." Daniel turned around. Kareth was standing in the commissary entrance, ducked slightly to fit under the frame, which she apparently hadn't bothered to do all the way, one shoulder still pressed against the top of the door, scanning the room with those amber eyes until they landed on him. They stayed there. "Oh," said Daniel. "That's Kareth. You know her?" "We've met a couple times." He turned back to his food. Mara stared at him. "Daniel, that is a Vaori warrior standing in our commissary looking at you like you owe her something. She does that." He pushed the protein substitute around his plate. "I think she's just checking in." "Checking in," Mara repeated. "On you. It seems that way. And this doesn't concern you. Not particularly." He glanced back. Kareth was still in the doorway. The other colonists had created a very noticeable empty space around the entrance, the kind of unconscious collective backing away that prey animals perform when a predator appears. She didn't seem to notice, or didn't care. Her eyes were still on Daniel. "She hasn't done anything threatening. She exists threatening Daniel." He almost smiled. "That's not really the same thing." The fourth time, she growled at him again, properly. This time, the full chest warning sound from their first meeting. They were outside the eastern gate, Daniel on his way to run a diagnostic on the perimeter sensors, and she stepped out from behind an outcropping of the rust-colored rock with perfect, infuriating timing, and the growl rolled across the distance between them like a small weather event. Daniel stopped walking. He looked at her. He tilted his head. The growl faded. "Is it communication?" he asked. "Or more of a—" He searched for the word. "A greeting?" She said nothing, but her chin dropped, fractionally, in a way that might have been acknowledgement. "Because if it's a greeting," he said, "I want you to know that it's working differently than you probably intended to." He paused. "It's still cute." The expression on Kareth's face was extraordinary. Not anger. He was learning to read the difference now. The specific tension around the orbital ridges that meant genuine fury versus the wider, more startled look she had. This was closer to something he might have called offended dignity in a human. The look of someone who had never in their life been robbed of their gravitas and had no framework for processing it. She made a sound, not the growl, something shorter and more guttural, somewhere between a huff and a syllable, and then she did something unexpected. She sat down on the rock outcropping, 8.5 feet of warrior, lowering herself onto a piece of rust-colored stone like someone who had decided to stay for a while. Daniel looked at her. Then he sat down too, a few feet away, and pulled out his diagnostic tablet and went to work. They stayed like that for an hour. She watched the horizon. He ran his diagnostics. Once, he pointed out a bird, one of the crow-like things that nested in the ridge's upper rocks, because it was doing something strange with its flight pattern that he found interesting. She watched it for a moment, her head tilted. When he finally stood to leave, she rose too, and for a moment they were just standing there, close enough that he had to look up to find her eyes. "Same time next week?" he said. Something shifted at the corner of her mouth. Not a smile, not in any human sense, but a movement, an acknowledgement. She turned and walked into the eastern wilderness. Daniel stood there for a moment, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time, something light and strange and unclassified, and then he picked up his tools and went back to work. By the sixth visit, people had started to talk. "You're aware," said Commander Helene Strauss, colony security chief, sitting across from Daniel in her office with the expression of someone who has run out of both patience and appropriate bureaucratic responses, that you are the only civilian in Redstone Reach who has had extended contact with a Veari warrior in the last 2 years. I'm aware, yes. And you understand that the territorial agreement specifies that all Veari interaction is supposed to go through the diplomatic liaison office. I do understand that. So what exactly is happening out there, Reeves? Daniel thought about it. I think, he said slowly, that she's curious about me. Strauss looked at him for a long moment. Curious. She keeps coming back. She doesn't threaten anyone. She just... He paused. She watches me work. Mostly. I talk to her sometimes. She doesn't talk back. Not in a way I can understand. But she doesn't leave either. And what started this? Daniel hesitated. I called her Growl cute. The silence in Commander Strauss's office was particularly pointed. You, she said, with the careful diction of someone who wants to make sure they're not mishearing, called a Veari warrior's threat display cute. It came out before I could stop it. And she didn't kill you. No, said Daniel. She seemed more surprised than anything. Strauss stared at him. She picked up a pen and put it down. She looked at the ceiling, then at the wall, then back at him. You're not cleared for diplomatic work, Reeves. I know. You're an engineer. I'm very aware. If this creates an incident, I'll tell her to stop visiting, he said, and then, surprising both of them, he added, though I'd rather not. Strauss looked at him for a long moment with the evaluating gaze of someone who is revising their understanding of a situation. Then she exhaled. Fine. Weekly check-ins with my office. You document every interaction. Yes, Commander. And Reeves. He stood up, reached for his jacket. Commander? Don't call her cute again. Daniel picked up his thermos. I'll do my best, he said, and he almost certainly meant it. Nobody tells you how hard it is to build trust across a language you don't share. Humans have a reflex for it, a set of small, automatic signals that say, I mean you no harm, I see you, I'm not leaving. A held gaze, a slow approach, an open hand, a name. These work beautifully between human beings, who have spent thousands of years calibrating to each other's signals, and they work almost nowhere else. The Veari have their own language of trust. Daniel didn't know what it was. He had to learn it from scratch, in real time, with no dictionary and no teacher, which meant he was going to get it wrong before he got it right. The question was, would she give him room to fail? The answer turned out to be yes, but not easily. It started with the tools. 2 months into what Daniel had begun, privately, to call their friendship, though he was uncertain the word applied across species, in quite the way he meant it. Carrot showed up at the processor where they had first met and stood watching him work for the usual hour or so. He was replacing a worn coupling on the secondary intake, which required a specific angle wrench that he kept having to set down and pick up and set down again because the access port was awkward and the angle was wrong. After the 5th time, he set it down and swore quietly under his breath. A large gray hand appeared in his peripheral vision, holding the wrench. He went still. Carrot was crouched beside him, having moved with total silence from where she had been standing, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating off her, which was substantial. The Veari ran hot, and she was holding the wrench out to him with a flat matter-of-factness of someone handing over something that was obviously needed. He took it carefully, making sure not to snatch at it. Thank you, he said. She didn't respond, but she stayed in position, and when he needed to set the wrench down again a few minutes later, she was there to hold it. She handed him the next piece he reached for her before his hand had fully extended. She tracked what he was doing with the focused, practical attention of someone who understood mechanical work, or who was learning it fast enough that it amounted to the same thing. They worked like that for 2 hours. When he finished, he sat back on his heels and looked at her. You're good at that, he said, her head tilted. That focused attention movement. Reading what someone needs, he said, anticipating it. He turned back to the processor, running a hand along the repaired coupling. That's a skill. It doesn't get enough credit. She made the short, huff-syllable sound. He was beginning to map these, slowly and uncertainly. This one seemed to accompany moments of information being received and considered, not dismissed. He packed up his tools. She watched him. He said, because he'd been thinking about it. "Can I ask you something?" She looked at him. He had learned that the direct, held gaze, was her version of permission. "Why do you keep coming back?" "You don't have to. I'm not interesting, particularly. I'm not important. I just fix things." He paused. "I don't understand what you're getting from this." The silence stretched. She looked at him for a long time with those amber eyes that caught light in layers, the way amber does, deep and complex. Then she did something he'd never seen her do. She reached out and pressed 2 fingers briefly against his chest, right over the sternum, just for a second, and then touched the same 2 fingers to her own chest. She held his gaze for a moment longer. Then she stood and walked away. Daniel sat with his tools in the rust-colored dirt for a long time, thinking about that. He asked the colony's cultural liaison about Ve'ari gestures. Her name was Priya, and she was one of 3 people in Redstone Reach who'd had formal training in Ve'ari culture, though she was the first to admit the training was incomplete. She listened to Daniel's description of the gesture with narrowing eyes. 2 fingers to the chest, then to their own chest? She repeated. "Yes." And she maintained eye contact. "Yes." Priya sat back and looked at the ceiling for a while. "The research is thin," she said finally, "because Ve'ari don't let outsiders study them willingly. But there's documentation of a contact ritual that involves chest placement. It's about here." She touched her own sternum. "The resonance chamber. Ve'ari have a secondary vocal structure there, more complex than ours. In their biology, that's essentially the seat of self, the place where the real sound comes from." "Okay," said Daniel, slowly, touching someone else's chest, and then your own. She paused. "The closest translation I've seen is something like, 'Same,' or 'maybe you and I.' It's a recognition gesture. It means she sees something in you that she recognizes in herself." Daniel thought about that for a very long time. "She's also," said Priya, with the careful tone of someone delivering important information, "been seen by 3 of our perimeter guards in the vicinity of your quarters on 2 separate occasions. Just watching, not threatening. Watching." "I know," said Daniel. "You know?" "I've seen her too." I wave. Priya stared at him. "Daniel, you understand this isn't normal, right? This is..." She stopped, restarted. "Ve'ari warriors don't seek out individual humans. They don't help with repairs. They don't..." She gestured vaguely at everything. "Whatever this is." "I know," said Daniel again. He looked at his hands. "I called her Growl cute the first time we met." "You..." Priya closed her eyes. "You called a Ve'ari war display cute." "Yes. And this," she gestured vaguely again, "is the result. Apparently." Priya was quiet for a moment. Then, what did it sound like? The growl? Daniel thought about it. Thought about the pattern in it. The structured rise and fall. The way it performed its own ferocity was something that looked, if you weren't afraid enough to miss it, almost like self-consciousness. Like something that had learned what it was supposed to sound like, he said, and was showing me. Priya looked at him for a long moment. "You might," she said carefully, "be the strangest engineer I've ever met." "I've heard that before," said Daniel. The language lesson started by accident. Daniel had begun bringing a second thermos of coffee to their meetings. Bad coffee, the same commissary blend, and leaving it on a rock between them. Kareth had ignored it for 4 sessions. On the 5th, she picked it up, examined it with the focused attention she gave everything, and made a questioning sound, a rising tone, 2 syllables. "Coffee," Daniel said. It's a drink. It's terrible, honestly, but I can't seem to stop." She repeated the sound. 2 syllables, slightly different intonation. Daniel laughed. He couldn't help it. "That's not quite right, but you're in the right direction." Her eyes moved to his face. Something in them, alert, tracking his expression. "Coffee," he said again, slower. "Kararfifi," she said. The Ve'ari vocalization was deeper, the consonants shaped by a different vocal architecture, but it was unmistakably an attempt. "Yes," said Daniel. "Exactly. Coffee." She looked at the thermos, then at him. Then she said with enormous gravity, "Karari, cute." The silence after this was extraordinary. Daniel looked at her. Her eyes were steady, watching him, and he thought, He was almost certain that the set of her face contained something that was, in its alien way, a deliberate joke. He started laughing. Really laughing. The kind that surprises you. And Kareth watched this with what he was increasingly confident was satisfaction. "Okay," he said, when he could speak again. "Okay, you've been saving that." "KRFV," she said again, serenely. "We are going to have a very complicated friendship," Daniel said. She tilted her head. Then, slowly, she touched 2 fingers to her chest, then to his. They came at night. The raiders, 3 ships, no insignia, the kind of vessels that exist in the borderlands because nobody's sovereign wants to claim them, dropped out of the dark at 4 a.m, when the colony's night watch was at its thinnest, and its sensors were pointed the wrong direction. They had done this before. They knew how frontier colonies slept. What they didn't know, what nobody knew, because nobody had thought to update the threat assessment to include it, was that something had been watching the eastern perimeter for the past 3 months. Something with amber eyes that didn't need to sleep. The attack alarm went off at 4:07 a.m. Kareth had already been moving for 6 minutes. Daniel woke to the alarm and was dressed and running before he was fully conscious, the way you do when you live on a frontier colony, and have spent 6 years training yourself to treat alarm sounds as commands. He pulled on his jacket, grabbed his toolkit, useless in a fight, he knew, but something to hold, and followed the stream of people moving toward the colony's central shelter. He stopped at the eastern gate. There was fire on the horizon. 2 of the raiders' landing parties had already touched down on the colony's outskirts. He could see the silhouettes of vehicles against the orange light, and beyond that muzzle flash. The sound reached him a second later. Sharp, irregular, nothing like the organized rhythm of a proper military engagement. Hit and run. Take what they could, break what they couldn't take. Standard raider playbook. He knew it from the colony briefings. 3 or 4 such attacks had hit other frontier settlements in the past 2 years. They came in fast, overwhelmed the local security, burned whatever they couldn't carry, and were gone before any real response could be organized. Redstone Reach had 42 armed security personnel. The raiders' vehicles alone outnumbered them. He was turning to follow the crowd to the shelter when he heard the sound. It wasn't a growl. It was different, higher, faster, complex in a way he'd never heard from Kareth, a rolling cascade of vocalization that cut through the alarm and the distant gunfire and the night wind and hit him somewhere behind his sternum. He turned back. She was at the edge of the eastern sector. He could see her in the firelight, armored, both hands now carrying short curved blades that he hadn't known she possessed, moving through the dark with a speed and fluidity that made his throat close. She wasn't alone. Behind her, 3 more Vaori warriors emerged from the eastern wilderness. Different physiques, different armor configurations, but the same controlled speed, the same absolute absence of hesitation. She stopped when she saw him. For a single second, in the middle of chaos, they looked at each other. "My people are in the shelters," he said. His voice was steadier than he expected. "The raiders will breach the main facility if security can't hold the eastern perimeter." Her eyes moved over the colony's layout. She'd watched him work here for months, had seen the structures, the systems, the geometry of a settlement. He watched her process it. "The magnetic or processor," he said, thinking fast. "If they get to it and overload the containment, it'll take out half the colony. It's the biggest target." Her gaze returned to him. Held. "I can shut it down remotely," he said. "But I need to get to the relay station on the northeast corner. And I need," he stopped, "revised. I'd be less likely to get shot with you." She looked at him for another moment. Then she said quietly in her deep textured voice, "KRFFE." It was, he thought, the most completely insane situation in which to be comforted by a word. "Yes," he said. "Let's go." What followed was 22 minutes of the most intense, sustained fear Daniel had ever experienced, punctuated by moments of such complete focused clarity that he stopped being afraid and became, briefly, just a problem to be solved. Kareth moved to the colony's outer structures like she had memorized them, which she probably had. Her 3 companions split off to intercept the raider ground teams, and the sounds of that, the sudden silence of raiders who had expected no real resistance meeting something that fundamentally reclassified the situation, reached Daniel as he ran, and he was glad he couldn't see it. She killed 2 raiders between the eastern gate and the relay station. He didn't watch, but he was close enough to know it was fast and efficient, and without the slightest tremor of hesitation. Afterward, she checked him with a look. Unharmed, good, and they kept moving. At the relay station, she held the door while he worked. His hands were shaking. Not badly, not enough to matter, but he could feel it, and she was behind him, facing outward, a wall of armored Veari warrior between him and anything that might come through the dark. He found that he could work. He found that her presence, her absolute, unquestioning certainty that nothing would reach him while she was there, was the most effectively calming thing he had ever experienced. He rerouted the power, locked the containment, ran the emergency shutdown on your processor, and then ran a second diagnostic because he didn't want to do this twice. Done, he said. The processor's cold. They can't use it as a weapon. She turned to look at him. Her eyes caught the red emergency lighting in the relay station. Amber turned orange, and her chest was moving with exertion. She'd been running too, he realized, had been running for most of the night, and there was a cut along her left forearm that she hadn't mentioned and hadn't slowed for. You're hurt, he said. She looked at the cut. The expression on her face said, approximately. This? I can close that, he said. He had a field kit in his toolkit. He always had a field kit, and she looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't entirely read, and then she held out her arm. He cleaned and closed the cut. Her biology was different. The skin denser, the healing already beginning in ways a human skin didn't, but the basics of wound care translated. She watched him work on her arm with the focused attention she gave everything, and Daniel focused on what his hands were doing and not on the fact that they were still shaking. There, he said when he was done. He looked up. That's what I can do. It's not much compared to. He gestured vaguely at everything she had done tonight. She looked at him. Then, slowly, she touched 2 fingers to the place where he closed her cut, then 2 fingers to his chest, then back to her own. Same. You and I. Yeah, said Daniel very quietly. Okay. Outside, the alarm was beginning to wind down. The raiders were retreating. The colony security team, reinforced by 3 Veari warriors who had materialized out of the dark and had no interest in negotiations, had apparently been persuasive. Redstone Reach had survived. There is a moment in every story of 2 different kinds of creature learning to trust each other. When the world decides it doesn't approve, it never announces itself. It doesn't arrive as a grand confrontation or an obvious turning point. It comes sideways, through the people who care about you, the traditions that made you, the tribe that defined you long before you ever had a choice in the matter. It comes as doubt dressed up as loyalty. It comes as love that's afraid of what you're becoming. For Kareth, it came in the form of her hunt elder, standing in the eastern wilderness 3 days after the raid, with 12 warriors at his back, and a question that wasn't really a question. For Daniel, it came from a meeting he wasn't supposed to know about. They both arrived at the same place by different roads, the moment where they had to decide what the bond was worth. Daniel found out about the Veari meeting from Priya, who had heard it from the Colonial Liaison Office, who had received a formal notification from a Veari territorial representative that was phrased in the careful diplomatic language that meant, something is being decided, and you should know it exists, and you should know it is none of your business. What was being decided, as best Priya could translate from the secondary sources she had access to, was whether Kareth's behavior was a violation of Veari warrior code. The term they use, Priya said, sitting across from Daniel in her small office with the careful expression of someone delivering news that is going to land badly, is Vorketh. It translates roughly as the softening. It's a failure state, a warrior who's become too attached to something outside the warrior path, too vulnerable. Too, she paused. Human in this context is a specific charge. Daniel sat with that for a moment. They think she's gone soft. They think her attachment to you is compromising her standing. Her hunt elder is apparently concerned about her ability to fight without restraint if it came to conflict with humans. Priya's voice was careful, precise. That's not an unreasonable concern from their perspective, Daniel. Their entire social structure is built on the idea that a warrior's allegiances are clear and their capabilities uncompromised. She fought fine 3 nights ago, he said, and was surprised by the edge in his own voice. I know. She was better than fine. She got to the eastern perimeter before anyone even knew the attack was starting. She protected. He stopped. She's not soft. I know, said Priya. But the Ve'ari aren't measuring softness the way you are. To them, softness isn't about capability. It's about where your heart is, who you would hesitate to harm if it came to that. She looked at him steadily. The question they're asking, I think, is whether she would ever hesitate to harm you. The question sat in the room between them. Would she? Priya asked quietly. Yes, said Daniel. Probably, and I would hesitate to do whatever I could to stop them from hurting her. He paused. Is that weakness? To them? Possibly. Then they're wrong, he said, and I want to be there when they tell her that. He wasn't there. He had no right to be, and he knew it, and he stayed away. What he knew of what happened came later, from Carrot herself, in fragments that he assembled slowly over several subsequent conversations. The language between them had grown in the months of their friendship into something functional and strange, a pidgin of Ve'ari vocalization and human words, and a shared body language that neither of them had invented intentionally, but both of them could read. The Hunt Elder, his name was Varric, and he was older than anyone else Daniel had heard Kareth mention, scarred in a particular way that meant he had survived everything, had put the question to her directly, in the formal mode that the Ve'ari use for judgments of warrior character. Is a human Vorketh? Have you been softened? She had answered him, as best Daniel could understand, in the following way. She had described the raid, the night watch, the raider ships, the vulnerability of the colony's eastern processing facility. She had described making the choice to move before the alarm, 6 minutes before, acting on what she had observed and what she knew, and described Daniel at the relay station, hands shaking, closing the process of containment with the tools he always carried, never once asking her to stay close or to protect him, just doing the work. She had said, Daniel had to sit with this for a long time, fitting the Ve'ari syllables to meanings he was only partially certain of, that strength was not only what a warrior could destroy, that the human with the shaking hands and the wrong kind of tools had done something that night that she, with all her speed and all her blades, could not have done, that the two of them together had saved the colony in a way that neither of them could have done separately, and that she did not think less of herself for this. She thought more. Varric had been silent for a long time. Then he had asked, would you hesitate to harm him? And Kareth had said, yes, as I would hesitate to harm you. That is not weakness. That is what I fight for. It was not, Priya told Daniel later, a resolution that fully satisfied the Hunt Elder. The Ve'ari elders did not reverse their cultural framework in a single conversation, and there remained real tension in the Eastern clan about Kareth's choices. But there was no formal censure, no order to end the contact. She had been permitted to continue. Daniel found out about the meeting the same evening it ended, and he spent most of that night sitting on the roof of his quarters, a habit he developed in the months since he'd started waving at Kareth in the dark, looking at the eastern wilderness and thinking. He thought about what Priya had told him. He thought about Vorketh, the softening. He thought about the humans in the colony who had been sending him sideways looks since the raid, not hostile exactly, but evaluating, recalibrating. This is the man the Ve'ari warrior fights for. What does that mean? He thought about Commander Strauss, who had called him the day after the raid and said, with the expression of someone completely revising their threat assessment, you understand that what happened 3 nights ago is going to have political implications I don't fully understand yet. I understand that. The Ve'ari came to our defense without being asked, without any agreement, because, she stopped, because Kareth did, said Daniel. Yes. Strauss had looked at him for a long time. What did you do, Reeves? In the beginning, what did you actually do? And Daniel had thought about a morning buy-in or a processor, and a growl that performed its own ferocity with something almost like self-consciousness, and a word that had come out before he could stop it. I was honest with her, he said. That's it. That's all I did. She had looked at him for another moment. Then, keep doing it. On the roof, in the dark, Daniel looked east and thought, whatever happens next, I'm not going to apologize for this. Not to the colony. Not to the Ve'ari elders. Not to anyone who decides that caring about someone across a species line is a liability. He thought, she called my coffee cute. She held my tools when I needed them. She stood between me and everything that wanted to hurt me, and she let me close her wound. And she said, "Same. You and I?" He thought, that is not a small thing. That is not a weakness. He was still sitting there when Kareth appeared at the edge of the colony's eastern boundary, moving through the dark with that unself-conscious precision, and looked up at where he was sitting on the roof with her amber eyes. He raised his thermos. She made the short huff syllable. Then she sat down on the rock at the colony's edge, facing east as she usually did, and stayed there. He stayed on the roof. Neither of them said anything. Neither of them had to. The second attack came 6 weeks later. And this time, it wasn't raiders. Raiders are afraid of something. They hit and run because they don't want to hold territory. And they don't want to hold territory because holding territory invites retaliation. Raiders, for all their violence, are operating from a fundamental uncertainty. We might lose. That uncertainty contains them. It shapes the limits of what they'll do. The Croft Collective had no such uncertainty. They were not raiders. They were not pirates or opportunists or desperate people making terrible choices on the edges of civilization. They were an expansionist force that had been systematically eliminating frontier colonies for 3 years, working outward from the core of their territory like a slow fire, clearing the Valeric Cluster 1 settlement at a time. They had never failed to take a colony they targeted. They had never been stopped. They arrived at Redstone Reach on a Tuesday morning with 4 warships and 1,500 ground troops, and they sent a single message ahead of the fleet: evacuate or die. You have 6 hours. Redstone Reach had 42 security personnel. The nearest military response was 14 hours away. And 2 people, a human engineer who fixed machines and a Vaori warrior who had been called soft by her own kind, had 6 hours to figure out whether that was enough. The colony's emergency council met in the first 30 minutes. Daniel was there, which surprised him. He had not expected to be invited, was not in the chain of command, was not a soldier or a strategist. But Commander Strauss had looked across the room when he arrived and said, simply, "Where's Kareth?" And Wei said, "I don't know, I'll find her." She had nodded, and that had apparently been his invitation. He found Kareth at the eastern boundary, already armored, already still in a particular way that meant she had been thinking for a while. He told her what was coming. He told her the numbers. She was quiet for a long moment. He watched her face, the amber eyes moving, tracking through something. Then she said, with careful, deliberate syllables, "Vaori, I bring your clan." She touched 2 fingers to her chest. "Vor Keth," she said, and the word in her voice was not a charge. It was a correction, a reclamation. "No, other Vaori clans?" She spread her hands, a gesture he had come to understand as many or more than I can count easily. "Will they come?" he asked. "In time." She looked at him steadily. He had learned enough about the Vaori by now to understand that certainty was something they did not claim easily, did not perform for comfort. She was not going to tell him yes if she didn't know. "I don't know," she said in her layered voice. "Then I go, you. Here, do what you do." "What I do is fix machines," he said. "Yes," she said. "Fix." She turned east. Daniel caught her arm. She stopped, looked down at his hand, looked at him, and he said quickly, "If this doesn't work." She placed 2 fingers on his hand, then on her own chest. "Same," she said. "You and I." Then she ran. Daniel went back to the colony. He had 4.5 hours. He thought about what he knew. 1,500 ground troops, 4 warships in orbit, a settlement that had been built for survival, but not for war. He thought about what he had. He thought about 6 years of knowing every pipe and valve and pressure coupling in Redstone Reach's infrastructure, every machine, every power line, every system that had been built to do one thing that could, in theory, be made to do something else. He went to find Mara. "I need you to help me think like a saboteur," he said. She looked at him. "Daniel, not hurting people, slowing people down, making their equipment not work, making their scanners confused, making their..." He spread his hands. "What's the most efficient way to make this colony as difficult as possible to take, without a standing army?" Mara was a former structural engineer who had built 3 different settlement designs from scratch and had the particular imagination of someone who understood how things broke. She looked at him for a moment with her evaluating eyes. "The magnetic or processor?" she said. if we reconfigure the output. Signal interference, he said. Yes, there's ship communications. Their ground vehicles will be following GPS markers. I can spoof those. The water reclamation system. She was moving now, pulling up schematics on her tablet. High pressure release at specific points. Yes. You'll need help. I need 3 other people. I need 4 teams of 2. Can you source that? For saving the colony? She was already moving. Daniel, I can source an army. For 3.5 hours, they worked. This is the part of the story that never gets told correctly in the versions that come later. The heroism of people with the wrong tools doing the exact right thing. Daniel and Mara and 11 other colonists who had technical backgrounds and no combat training systematically rewired, reconfigured, and repurposed the infrastructure of Redstone Reach into something that was not a weapon and was not a fortress, but was something stranger and, in its way, more effective, a place that simply did not behave the way an attacking force expected a place to behave. The Processor's magnetic output, redirected to the colony's power grid, created a field that scrambled electronic communications within a 3-kilometer radius. The GPS spoofing seeded false waypoints into the Croft Collective's navigation systems. The water reclamation's high-pressure lines were rerouted to points along the colony's outer edge, positioned to be triggered remotely. The lighting systems, entirely mundane, were programmed on a cycling pattern that made optical targeting unreliable. None of it would stop 1,500 soldiers. It wasn't meant to. It was meant to slow them down, to confuse them, to make every step cost more than it should, to buy time. The Croft Collective arrived 20 minutes ahead of schedule. The confusion started immediately. Their advanced vehicle's navigation gave conflicting signals. Their communications between ground teams and orbital ships went intermittent, then unreliable. Their scouts reported infrastructure configurations that didn't match the colony blueprints they'd acquired, because Daniel had spent the last 3 hours making them not match. Strauss's security team, 42 people against 1,500, did not fight to win. They fought to delay, to cost, to force the Croft to move slowly through a colony that kept behaving strangely. They were precise, and they were very brave, and they were losing ground. And then, from the east, the sound came. Daniel heard it from the relay station where he was running his 3rd signal override, and he stopped what he was doing, because the sound did not have a size that fit in his experience. It was many Veari, dozens of them, their war voices layered into something that resonated in the rock and the air and the chest simultaneously, and it was coming from the eastern wilderness, and then it was everywhere, on all sides, and the Croft Collective's advance stopped as if a single switch had been thrown. Kareth had brought the other clans. The battle lasted 4 hours. Daniel didn't see most of it. He stayed at the relay station, keeping the communications jamming active, keeping the navigation spoofing running, because his job was the machines, and the machines mattered. Once, a Croft soldier found the relay station and broke down the door, and Daniel hit it with a wrench, and then felt sick about it for a week. And the soldier survived, and that was, as best he could determine, the entirety of Daniel Reeves's personal combat record. When it ended, the Croft Collective retreated to their ships with 50% of their ground force out of action, and none of their objectives achieved. They had never retreated from a frontier colony before. They had, in fact, never retreated at all. The colonial military arrived 4 hours later, to a colony that had already won. The official account cited the Veari alliance, the colony's defensive preparation, and electronic warfare capabilities of the settlement's engineering team. Daniel read this and thought it was a reasonable summary. He thought it left some things out. He found Kareth at the eastern boundary in the afternoon, after the military had done their assessment and the colony had begun the long, strange process of understanding that it had survived something that shouldn't have been survivable. She was sitting on the rock outcropping where they had first sat together, and she looked tired in the way that Veari looked tired. Not diminished, not soft, but settled, as if the intensity had been turned down 2 notches, and everything was simply quieter now. He sat down next to her. He had 2 thermoses of bad coffee. He set one between them. She picked it up, drank it. They'd worked out the temperature issue weeks ago. Veari ran hot. Her version needed to be hotter. Kararfifi, she said. Still terrible, he agreed. They sat in the late afternoon light, the rust-colored colony behind them and the eastern wilderness ahead, and it was quiet in a particular way that comes after loud things. "Your hunt elder," Daniel said. "Varric, will this change things?" She was quiet for a moment. Then, with careful syllables, "Hard. Still hard." She paused. "Better. Better," he repeated. She touched 2 fingers to his chest. Then her own. Then she held out her hand. Palm up, fingers open, which was not, as far as he knew, a standard Veari gesture, but which was clearly borrowed from somewhere, from someone, from 6 months of watching a human engineer hold out tools and thermoses and field kit supplies with open hands. He placed his hand in hers. Her grip was careful. She could, and they both knew this, have closed her hand around his and ended several things very quickly. The care was the whole point. The deliberate choice of how much and how gently. "What starts with one word," she said, slowly, in her layered voice, fitting the human sound around meanings of language had for centuries but it was only just reaching, "does not end with one war." He looked at her. "No," he said, "it doesn't. We are," she paused, selecting, "beginning." "Yes," said Daniel Reeves, an ordinary engineer from a frontier colony who had never wanted to be interesting, sitting next to the most impressive living thing he had ever seen, in the rust-colored late afternoon light of a day that would change the shape of what was possible between their 2 peoples. "That's exactly what we are." The wind came in from the eastern ridge. The colony lived. The beginning continued.